Self-Determination in the Third World, Indonesia, by Jacob, Rohan, Seif, and Chris. Thesis. The Indonesian nationalists finally had the opportunity for freedom, but Dutch invaders challenged their nationalistic ideals, while internal tensions between the Indonesian army and the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party, challenged Indonesia's newfound democracy. Indonesia is motivated to establish self-determination as they were oppressed by the Japanese for years during World War II. So now they finally have the opportunity to be free again, and they don't want to mess it up or have their freedom be taken away from them again.
Background. What relations did Indonesia have with colonial empires pre-1945? How did World War II bring collapse of colonial empires? The war had severely weakened European nations, including those colonies outside of Europe. The war had weakened these nations' economic systems, which forced them to focus on their own rather than their colonies. Many colonies used the war as an opportunity to break free from the control of European nations and aspired to create their own government. The military couldn't do much because they were too busy focusing on the war and could not supervise the colonies, what they were doing, and weren't able to shut down any rising revolts. Due to the high death toll of soldiers, the European militaries also grew weaker. The superpowers America and the Soviet Union also opposed colonization and were a big influence on why decolonization sped up so fast due to them having views on anti-imperialism. America wanted to promote democracy and would help colonies in Africa and Asia who wanted independence. This would eventually force Europe to allow their colonies in those regions to gain independence. The Dutch United East India Company dominated economically and politically and was a major power in Asian trade. Though against the English India Tea Party, it went bankrupt and the Dutch needed some source of income. Parts of Java, Jakarta today, were nationalized by the Dutch, and over time, the Dutch slowly colonized the whole of the archipelago. These islands were known as the Dutch Indies. They would then use Java as a source of revenue and would help benefit the Dutch economy. From 1870 to 1900, there was a huge influence of private capitalism on colonial policy. The Dutch as well started to expand the archipelago to prevent any other European nations from taking over them. As the 20th century went on, many of the citizens started to recognize themselves as Indonesians and started to have a sense of nationalism, and it would drive them to get their independence. Then, in World War II, Japan invaded the Dutch Indies, overthrowing all of the Dutch leaders and replacing them with Indonesians. This was to try and gain their support of the Indonesian citizens, as they were already being put through hard labor for their resources. Though because of the Indonesian nationalist movements being supported by the Japanese, Indonesia proclaimed independence when the war was over, when Japan surrendered after the atomic bombings. Timeline. There are 5 major events that happened during the time period of 1950 to 1967. The first one was when the Japanese, who previously invaded Indonesia, surrendered after World War II. This let Indonesia redeclare independence on August 17, 1945. Japan recognized Indonesia as an independent nation, and now Indonesia would set forth the beginning of their complete independence movement. The next key event was the Dutch transferring sovereignty to Indonesia. Dutch troops went to go and try to reclaim order in Indonesia. Police actions are known as colonial war, and they would try to shut down any independence movements. These actions were criticized not just by the people internationally, but from the Dutch people themselves in the Netherlands. They were already facing great pressure from the US, so the Netherlands had no choice but to recognize Indonesia's independence. They officially transferred sovereignty to Indonesia in December 1949. The event after this was when the people of Moluccas, also known as the Maluku Islands today, tried to proclaim independence and secede from Indonesia. The United Nations Commission on Indonesia tried to resolve the dispute between the people of Moluccas and the Indonesian government, but failed to get the Indonesian government to agree on any of its compromises. The Republic of Indonesia was established by the Indonesian government to suppress the Moluccas rebellion. The Moluccas would then appeal to the United Nations Commission on Indonesia, and they would try to get the Republic of Indonesia to suspend military operations on October 5, 1950, but was rejected a few days later. The Republic of Indonesia was successful in suppressing the Moluccas. The fourth event is the September 30th movement. Before the movement, the rise of communism was spreading fast, and it had come to Indonesia and spread fear and terror among its citizens. The PKI was a communist party in Indonesia. The Communist Party attacked 7 anti-communist generals and killed 6 of them. This was believed to be an attack to take over the country and turn it into a communist regime. 80,000 to 1 million people who were or were to believe to be associated with the PKI were killed by the Indonesian army across Java and Bali. Other suspected communist families were denied basic rights, were denied a fair trial, and denied equal opportunities in employment. Finally, the last event was when the first president, Sukarno, transferred power to Suharto in 1966. The movement on September 30th, 1965 may have failed, but destabilized the government of Indonesia, eliminating the Sukarno regime. People started to resent Sukarno for allowing the PKI to gain too much influence. He also lost support from the military. With extreme pressure from the military, Sukarno delegated his powers to Suharto. With the power he gained, Suharto started to purge people associated with the PKI and destroyed it completely. His actions would let him rise to become the head of government and eventually appointed the president. This image right here is a picture of Sukarno, and then the symbol in the top right corner is a symbol of the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party.
Sukarno. Who was Sukarno and what role did he play? Sukarno was the first Indonesian president, and he was the main leader of the Indonesian nationalist movement. Sukarno played a pivotal role in getting Indonesian independence as he made collaborations with the Japanese to give Indonesia independence. Through his collaborations, he attained administrative positions for Indonesians, and he got the authority to create political parties and an army. Sukarno declared independence on August 15th, 1945, and near the end of Sukarno's presidency, he was overthrown by Suharto. Muhammad Hatta. Who was Hatta and what role did he play? He was the Indonesian's first vice president and a leader of the Indonesian nationalist movement, where he sided with Sukarno. What was his role in the nationalist movement? He worked in Japanese occupation government along with Sukarno, and he communicated with other countries / people in search of assistance for Indonesians. Hatta resigned from vice presidency due to disagreements with Sukarno's policy of democracy.
Theme connection. What three themes does our topic connect to and why? Nationalism. Nationalism is what the nationalists lived by, the idea that united them, that they fought for. Nationalism is the reason why Indonesians were able to fight back against the Dutch and British. It is what united them. The nationalist leader Sukarno was a key figure in the most important movement in Indonesia. Challenges to democracy. Challenges to democracy connect to the Indonesian nationalist movement, as the Indonesians' newfound democracy gets challenged by Suharto as he takes it over by staging a coup, turning it into a totalitarian dictatorship. Effects on decolonization. The nationalists colonized themselves from the controlling Japanese at the beginning of the movement, and as soon as they are not controlled, the Dutch swoop in and attempt to recolonize them. When they fight back and get rid of the Dutch, the effects of decolonization start and take effect as the tensions begin to form inside the government. And since they are not ruled by one colony anymore, everyone has their own ideals, and that leads them to form their own opinions on how they think the country should be governed, leading to the re-eruption of the PKI. Analysis. Internal issues, successes, and challenges. An internal issue in the Indonesian nationalist movement was the Indonesian Communist Party, which created tensions between them and the Indonesian army. A coup on September 3rd, 1965, which was led by the leftist army officers, killed 500,000 communists and communist sympathizers. This internal issue is significant because it is the coup that let Suharto take control of the government of Indonesia. Successes. The Battle of Surabaya was when the British and Dutch invaded Indonesia soon after Indonesia was freed from the Japanese control. Specifically, the British invaded and the Indonesians were able to hold them off for some time. So it was a success in the Indonesian eyes as they were able to hold them off until the UN intervened. Challenges. A challenge for the Indonesian nationalist movement were the Dutch military offensives that attempted to reestablish control over Indonesia. Analysis. Consequences and successes. A short-term consequence of the nationalist movement was the British and Dutch invading. As we previously covered, After many battles and intervention by the UN, the nationalists were finally able to push the invaders out for good. Another short-term consequence of the movement was the Indonesian army started a coup, which caused 500,000 communists and communist sympathizers to be killed. It started when the tensions between the army and PKA finally boiled over when Sukarno dissolved the elected parliament and created an appointed parliament. This was because the masses supported and represented the communists, and Sukarno wanted to let the masses have more of a say in internal affairs. This then caused the army to lose power in internal affairs, and they saw themselves being replaced with the communists, so they staged a coup against the masses, who were majority communists, on September 30th, 1965. Suharto then saw an opportunity to take power and push Sukarno aside, so he did this by taking executive control and then getting rid of Sukarno. The long-term consequence of the movement was Suharto becoming president and staying in power until 1998 with the use of rigged elections. During his presidency, he had the New Order policy, which restricted political activity. He also put in strict controls on the media and newspapers. While he was super controlling, he also boosted Indonesia's economy and reduced the amount of people living in poverty while making it a welcoming place for foreign capital. The unintended consequence of the Indonesian nationalist movement were all the bloody conflicts just for the nationalist movement led by Sukarno to be taken over by the military dictatorship of Suharto. Successes. Some may argue that the movement was successful in the way that it pushed back the English and Dutch trying to colonize it once and for all. But the newfound independence gave way for the PKA to form, which caused many internal conflicts within Indonesia. The conflicts eventually ended in Sukarno being replaced by Suharto and Indonesia now being run as a dictatorship. So in the end, while the nationalists were successful at first, the internal conflict between the communists and the army is what tore them apart and led to Indonesia becoming a dictatorship controlled by Suharto.
Cold War connection, alignment, outside pressure. Indonesia was not aligned, as the fighting between the US and the USSR never really concerned them. While there was the PKI, the Indonesian Communist Party, they never really received enough support to become a major ally to the Soviets. The outside pressure that Indonesia faced was the fact that their whole nationalist movement was shaped around the outside pressure that the country was facing. It started with them being freed from Japanese control, but soon after, the Dutch, with help from the British, tried to take over with the goal of colonizing Indonesia. There was more outside pressure this time from the UN to actually call for a ceasefire between the Dutch and the Indonesian nationalists.
Indonesia's struggle for self-determination led to them relying on nationalism as their weapon for establishing their sovereignty in the world. But as the famous quote goes, all democracies fail because people are stupid. Sukarno's mistakes in trying to balance power between the Indonesian army and the PKA led to his downfall, with Suharto taking power and establishing a totalitarian dictatorship. In the end, they were able to establish themselves in the world as a fierce dictatorship, but also as a strong nation with a growing economy.